So we have this problem with the Israelites and these kind of physical needs that they have. But then there's also another kind of category of rebellion that takes place with the Israelites in the wilderness, and that kind of could be summed up with Korah and some others, where there's this desire to not submit to God's desire of worship. Really, what's happening here is that it's not so much that they doubt God, it's or rebelling against God. They're rebelling against the way He's called them to worship. And that's kind of an interesting thing because I don't know that as a younger Christian I would have so closely connected who God is and how He calls us to worship Him. Does that make sense?
Sure.
I don't know if I would have thought that the way that God calls us to worship Him is arbitrary, but I don't think that I would have understood the importance of that. So now, as you've been a Christian for years now, what do you see in that connection between the nature of who God is, His character, and the way He calls us to worship?
I don't know that I've got an exhaustive answer here, but I'll speak with analogy. And I think of my sons, and they're still pretty young, and at the age that they are, especially my youngest, he's not the most capable. Mm-hmm. And so in that state, intention goes a long way with me, mm-hmm. right? And he might be intending to do something good or great, and that means a lot at this stage, right? Mm-hmm. But if he's 30 and I'm still stuck at intention means a lot, mm-hmm. but he doesn't accomplish anything, we might right. have some things to talk about, right? And I think with God, like some of Paul's lofty prayers about knowing better who God is, but also having a better knowledge that we can carry out His will and accomplish good things. Mm-hmm. And I think of some of the foolish things I did in some of my naive times in my youth, thinking I was doing good things, but mm-hmm. but probably not accomplishing much at all. And I think God desires, has a very specific prescription for how we should live and worship Him. Maybe precisely along those lines, He actually wants us to accomplish things that are good, not just have the intention of doing good things.
Mm-hmm. When you look at the situation with Israel in the desert, let me ask you this. I don't know when you first read through the story of the Exodus and the wandering in the wilderness, but my suspicion is that you probably had a similar experience to me, in that your recollection of it or your impression of it when you got done reading is that Israel was always goofing up and God was always mad at them.
Yes.
Yeah. And that was probably largely because Israel's always goofing up and God's always mad at them. But the interesting thing is that the nature of this covenant, one of the aspects of this covenant, is to show us our sin. And I find that to be really interesting, that one of the problems that Israel experiences is that God is now defining Himself to them. And the upshot of that is not that they're going to feel so good about themselves, but that they're going to feel fairly bad about themselves. And it's not a very pleasant experience. What do you make of God saying, hey, I'm going to get you out of your bondage, and I'm going to take you into the wilderness, and I'm going to show you how bad you are?
Well, it actually even talks about, the Lord testing them in the wilderness, right. and things of this sort at different places. And but tests are a funny thing. There's I had a friend that went to a college where they had no tests, mm-hmm. no grades. And you might imagine some of the
mm-hmm. Is it Evergreen?
The quality of student. It was in Oregon.
Evergreen.
That helps. Okay, might be Evergreen. But yeah, and he actually wasn't a bad student himself, or at least became a much better student later on in grad school and stuff. But you can imagine that they're not going to be competing with MIT anytime soon, right. or anything like this. And tests are a great thing. And one, if you know that a test is coming, it often spurs some effort mm-hmm. in the meantime. But they often also reveal where you've failed. Right. But failure, in college is never a permanent thing until the very end, at least. And even then, obviously, you can get another degree or do whatever you mm-hmm. want, And and same thing in life, your failures, as long as you're still living and breathing, failures never have to be a permanent thing at all. But if there's never a test, you might never see your failure and realize that there's something more that God wants for and from you.
Yeah, well, and one of the things that's really interesting as you bring up tests as an example is how do you know where the gaps in your knowledge are if you're never tested? How do you know what you don't know? How do you know where you stand? And that's not a minor thing, because if you're going to make progress, if you're going to get someplace better, you have to know where your current weaknesses are, where your current failings are. You need to know what you currently don't know if you're going to fix those gaps in your knowledge. And there's a sense in which kind of everything in life is a test. And in my own life, I experience what Israel did, where I get frustrated by the fact that there's a test and I'm not doing well on it. But how do I get a clear picture of myself? I guess you could say, well, I just want to live in ignorance my whole life, but really that's not very helpful, because when you run into people who have that attitude, you're usually not super impressed by that. Right?
Well, I think about being a kid, and when I was a kid, there were certain things that I was just innately good at, and then a whole slew of things that I was not. And unfortunately, that bred in me to want to only do the things I was good at and not do the other things. So I didn't ride a bike till I was 8 years old, or I didn't learn to swim because I just didn't innately know how to swim. Go figure. And and it's super harmful. But I think we can, desire to live that life as an adult, right? And just I just want to keep doing the things I'm good at and not really ever be complete.
And so one of the things that God is doing is he's showing. I mean, think about it from the standpoint of Korah. Korah is basically saying we should be able to lead our own worship and do this the way that we want to do it. And by God building this tabernacle and instituting the priests and having them wear all these things and do all the, basically what he's saying is you are doing it completely wrong. Now, the thing is that you might say, well, big deal. But it actually is a big deal, right? Because, there's a lot of things you can do wrong. You can say, as an example, let's say this. When you grew up, there was a point at which you realized your parents didn't know everything. And then all of a sudden in your teenage years, you kind of decide that your parents don't actually know anything.
When I also realized how much that I knew.
Right. And so the thing is that do you want to live in that forever, right? You recognize the failings of your parents, but you have no ability to recognize your own failings. Is being a teenager forever the great the great life that we would all aspire to?
No, because thinking you're glorious and being glorious are not the same thing.
Right,
When you're a
not at all.
teenager.
And one of the things that's really fascinating is that part of the problem is that before you became a teenager and recognized the failings, you lived in your parents' household, and however your parents were leading the family and conducting the family, that's the way that's all you knew.
That's the standard,
that was the standard. That's the way it should be done. And one of the things that's interesting about that is that's actually you never fully get out of that. And does it matter whether your parents were doing that well or poorly?
Yeah.
Yeah, it matters a lot. In fact, there's very few things that matter more than that. And we were talking about the Turpin family in a sermon recently, and they have their kids living in squalor. These kids grow up with this really warped view of love and what a family is, what it means. The words father, mother, love, family, all these things now have completely different meanings, and that actually is really important to your ability to be blessed as you get older. And you'd say, well, is that important? Of course it is. Well, how much more important is it that God be worshipped, defined and worshipped correctly? So one of the things that bears thinking about is that if God, he's brought them into the wilderness, and one of the things that he's doing is kind of putting them to the test or showing them their faults, and you think, well, that doesn't sound very fun or good. Does it matter, like how severe and how extensive those faults are.
Yes.
Yes, okay. And it matters obviously to them and how they feel about things, but also it matters from another standpoint, which is, you can get really down with this. You can say, well, I'm a terrible person. And then you think, well, what kind of God do we serve who wants us to believe how terrible we are? But there's an element of this that's really important because God's instituting this sacrificial system, which has something to do with the taking away of sins. And obviously, we know that those animal sacrifices don't take away sins, and there was something of a knowledge of that even in their time. But they also knew that it was connected somehow to how God would really take away sins. And obviously, we know now that has to do with Christ and his sacrifice. But the thing is that you don't recognize how great a gift grace is and forgiveness is if you don't understand how much you've been forgiven for. If you think that I needed a 90 on the test and I got an 88 and God bumped me up those 2 points. If that's the way that you think of your life, then you're not going to be all that grateful to God for anything. But if you really realize the state that you were in and the nature of God's grace to you, then obviously there's a huge amount of joy that comes out of that, because really joy doesn't have to do with us getting what we think we've deserved. That doesn't make you joyful. Joy has to do with getting more than you've deserved.